Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Camwood's Crash Course on the discovery around AppStream 2.0 and workspaces and ultimately how it can benefit and help your organization moving forwards. From an agenda perspective, we're going to initially start talking about AppStream 2.0 and how it can benefit your organization. We're then going to be moving on to AWS Workspaces and how that's changing the way organizations work, especially from a hybrid capacity point of view. We've also been very, very lucky to get John Cook from AWS with us. I think he's going to be talking about some specific industry use cases. We're then going to do a quick section around the implementation and the transition to both sets of technologies and how organizations can get started. And then we'll start capturing some questions as we go through it. So please, if you do have questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat and we'll pick it up at the Q&A panel at the back end of the session. So from an introductory point of view, like I said, my name's Daniel Williams. I'm head of technology for Camwood. I've been in the organisation for a couple of years now. I'm primarily responsible for client engagements, technology strategy for the organisations, and act as sort of thought leadership for a lot of our organisations as well. We've also got John Cook with us. So John, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself and then we can get going.
Thanks, Dan. Yes, great to be here. So, yeah, John Cook, I head up, as Dan's put there, the sales function related to our workspaces and AppStream offerings for the region. Before I was at AWS, I was at Citrix for many years as well, but I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to my session. Thanks, Dan.
Excellent. Thank you very much, John. Okay, as per the agenda, I thought we'd kick off around sort of AppStream 2.0 and the benefits associated from that point of view. But as with anything, it's probably a really good idea to start off with what AppStream 2.0 is from an explanation perspective. So really, when it comes to end user computing, there's two typically types of technology utilized whenever we go into the virtual desktop infrastructure side of things, and that is virtual desktops. But ultimately, from an AppStream 2.0 perspective, we're talking about remote app streaming. So a lot of people are probably familiar with other vendor types of technology, things like Citrix, VMware, and even Microsoft RDS or Azure Virtual Desktop in these days. AWS have a similar solution through AppStream 2.0. But the important thing to note as part of it really is the integration and the availability of the application into your existing infrastructure. So if you have existing on-premises infrastructure, if you have AWS public cloud infrastructure, GCP infrastructure, Microsoft Azure infrastructure, AppStream 2.0 can deliver those applications to all of your end users, regardless of physical or geographical location. So we see a lot of use cases for software vendors. So if they want to distribute out an application out to their customers, software as a service vendors sometimes do provide this, and that's certainly a good use case. If we've got use cases where organizations want to issue out considerably sort of really resource intensive hungry applications, things like 3ds Max, AutoCAD, Navisite, etc. All of those things are typically made available through a technology like AppStream 2.0. So the important thing, like I said, is it incorporates and touches all points with your infrastructure, regardless of physical location. From a benefit perspective, it is a fully managed service delivered by AWS, and I've got another slide on it, so it's just shortly after, but it's a managed service where AWS do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So they'll take care of physical infrastructure, a lot of the storage administration, and the customer is ultimately responsible for a really small section of the image management and application management. The security posture as a whole is really, really impressive. So not only do you get all the security settings and policies available within the AWS public cloud, you also get additional sets of security policies and posture settings that are associated to your existing infrastructure. So linking into things like Active Directory, maybe you want to integrate into your existing MFA solution provider that you've got a connectivity and sort of on-premises solutions for. That's something that can plug in directly into AppStream 2.0 to secure access to your applications entirely. I don't think it would be not right to sort of speak about the scale on demand and the pay-as-you-go pricing effectively associated to AWS public cloud infrastructure. So it's really important to note whenever you're talking about and you're comparing solutions like AWS AppStream 2.0 and other solutions, traditional on-premises solutions like Citrix and VMware, you scale on demand, so you don't have to over-purchase infrastructure to support capacity demands. It's really a case of you can be able to scale up and down, in and out on demand, depending on what your organization and your users need as well. From a pay-as-you-go pricing point of view, it's really straightforward. You only pay for what you use effectively. So again, taking that traditional sort of CapEx model and spend and flipping that into an operational or an OpEx cost model. So it's much more optimal from a cost expenditure point of view, which has been really, really key, certainly as we've gone through the hybrid working model change and ultimately the pandemic as a whole. As I've talked about, the integration into your IT infrastructure as a whole, so things like connecting into your on-premises Active Directory, maybe you've got multi-factor authentication providers you need to integrate it into your application infrastructure, your data infrastructure, regardless of whether it's on-prem or if it's in AWS or in another public cloud provider. As long as AppStream 2.0 can see that infrastructure, it can deliver the applications onto the devices itself. From an application management perspective, what we've also got is a very simplistic application management plane as well. So being able to deliver, manage, and update those applications on a regular basis is streamlined, ultimately how organizations are streaming applications as a whole. Like I said, I thought I'd touch on sort of the managed service element, and this is very typical for how public cloud services work. So for those of you who aren't familiar with how things like AWS public cloud works traditionally from an infrastructure perspective, we've got two differentiating sort of responsibility layers. So everything sort of just below the purple there is ultimately what AWS manages, and it is managed by AppStream 2.0 as well. So we start in the red, which is typically physical infrastructure, so things like power, server infrastructure, storage infrastructure, physical security, which is all managed and operated within AWS data centers across the globe. On top of that, moving into the green layer, and that's where ultimately the AWS infrastructure staff take care of things like server administration, storage administration, hypervisor technology, VDI control plane, all of those bits that you would normally deal with internally when you've got on-premises VDI infrastructure is now taken care of by AWS from that perspective. So ultimately just removing that overhead associated to it and the skills associated to it as well. So the final bit, which is ultimately what you or organizations are typically responsible for, which is the image and application management and the directory services and policies associated to it. So it really is that sort of typical 80-20 rule, and it just makes managing the whole infrastructure much, much easier moving forwards. Now we've sort of covered workspaces, we're going to move on to sorry, not Workspace. Now we've covered AppStream, we're going to be moving on to AWS Workspaces, which is the other solution available within the EUC stack. And ultimately, we're going to be talking about how this has changed the way organizations are working within hybrid working models. So again, we're going to kick off with what is AWS Workspaces. For those of you ultimately who don't know, AWS Workspaces is AWS's proprietary software that provides end user compute and persistent desktops out to organizations and end users. So again, if you're familiar with traditional VDI, if you're familiar with other sort of cloud solution provider vendor solution technology stacks that are out there, it's exactly the same thing. The key differentiator is ultimately it's a persistent desktop. So a user will log into the same desktop regardless of physical device they're logging into or geographical location. They will get the same experience again and again and again. So it provides a true Windows or Linux desktop experience from that perspective, so end users will be able to adopt it with relative ease. There's no real barriers from that point of view. And again, sort of following AppStream 2.0, it is a much, much lower TCO perspective, not just from a capacity point of view, but more from that OpEx variable cost model that I've been talking about sort of in previous slides from that perspective. So from a traditional VDI comparison model, it is a much more comparative and optimal model to be adopting from a costing and from a scalability point of view. Again, sort of following these sorts of how AWS operate across their entire cloud infrastructure, it has a much more simplified management plane. There isn't lots and lots and lots and lots of different complexities and different policy sets and solutions you need to plug into it to get it to work. It is very simplified in terms of being able to provision it and then streamline sort of management approach to look after the infrastructure as well. And then sort of finally, we're talking about AWS public cloud, so it'd be relevant to say that you can make use of the unlimited scale and ultimately the rapid deployment mechanisms that AWS Workspace customers have available to them. And I thought this would be quite an interesting slide. It looks quite busy, but it's actually quite simplistic in terms of the logic and the user journey, how they connect in. So typically we start on the top left-hand side. So a user will log into a secure web browser. So they'll pop in the AWS web address, or they will have the desktop application installed on their device itself. From there, accessing the AWS infrastructure, that will then direct it to the specific AD infrastructure or the directory services specific to that customer in the organization. And then depending on what type of authentication service you've enabled, maybe using the native standalone AWS one, or maybe you're connecting back into your on-premises Active Directory services, it will then pass the logic flow so the end user can authenticate using their username, password, multi-factor authentication, any additional services associated to it. And then from there, AWS will then pass the authentication and the access back into Workspaces itself, and the user will log on and then be presented with a full desktop experience. Obviously, that explanation took longer than the actual connection process itself, so that happens within milliseconds. So it really is a streamlined and simplified process, and that is really, really quick from an end user perspective as well. So the other bit I wanted to talk about, and sort of the main reason why we wanted to talk about Workspaces, is ultimately how this has changed how organizations have adopted things like Workspaces in the past. I did say to myself before I came onto this webinar, I didn't want to talk about the pandemic, but unfortunately, it is key. The last 2 years has seen a massive drive how hybrid models have been adopted. I think the quote at the top from Forrester is ultimately, hybrid work needs cloud PCs, not VDI, and I think that's more relevant. And the whole reason why it's relevant, I think we came into the pandemic and into hybrid working. Initially, we saw on-premises capacities for VDI and VPN repeater technologies and solutions in place were just maxed out because organizations weren't building their infrastructure to support the amount of remote workers that were coming through the pandemic, and ultimately the working from home model. So being able to adopt something like a cloud PC quickly, easily, connect it into your on-premises infrastructure was an option organizations needed to adopt quickly. And I think it's important now that we're coming out of the pandemic and all the restrictions have been removed, certainly in the UK. Hybrid working is here to stay. There's employees now have or users now have a position of, we've worked from home the last 2 years. We've shown we are as productive, if not more productive, than being in the office and traveling in and wasting all that time on travel. So it's fair to say that regardless of organizational sort of policies and procedure sets, hybrid models are here to stay, and ultimately moving away from that traditional on-prem capacity restriction we had and adopting things like Workspaces has just made that a lot easier. The other point to talk about is ultimately the security posture framework erosion that we saw across the board. So when hybrid model was adopted, people were connecting in from unsecured devices, unmanaged devices from a personal perspective, that maybe they didn't get corporate devices to take home with them, so they had to log in and connect in utilizing their personal devices. It's not always going to be great from that point of view. And we saw cybersecurity threats and attacks shoot through the roof during this procedure. So being able to use a centralized model with something like Workspaces just makes the security framework so much easier to manage. And ultimately, you can be a lot more rigid with the process as well. So you can enable things like I said, multi-factor authentication, different levels of encryption associated to the infrastructure as well, any other security policies that come out of the box available with AWS as well. Probably the most important thing, end user experience. A lot of people talk about the UX journey and the end user experience. It's ultimately one of the single most important things when we talk about hybrid working. Ultimately, if you give an end user everything that they need to do to stay productive in a persistent environment, that they get the same experience again and again, they're going to be productive. And it was shown through hybrid working and working from home, productivity sort of shot through the roof. And being able to amalgamate that with consistent experience every single time is just going to make the end user much happier. They don't have to worry about their rubbish personal device trying to boot up. The days of turning a laptop on, going and make yourself a cup of tea and then come back again and still waiting for it shouldn't exist anymore. And that's certainly something that AWS can improve upon and has provided through the Workspaces solution as a whole. And again, scale on demand, cost optimal. You're only really paying for what you use. You're scaling on demand. So if you've got more users that need to come into the environment because of a particular reason, maybe you're a university and public sector that need to provide workspaces out to lots of people very quickly and for a short period of time, that is a much more optimal method than adding it to existing on-premises VDI capacity or buying new VDI capacity to support these new users coming into the environment. It's just so much easier and so much cheaper to utilize something like the AWS Workspaces solution that can just scale on demand and be an operational cost model instead of CapEx. John, unfortunately, I'm going to pick a little bit on you on this particular section, but what I thought would be good is really to talk about AWS Workspaces and Citrix and VMware and sort of how they compare. And I appreciate, John, you worked for Citrix for a very long time, so you probably know better than any of us, really. And I thought it'd be good to talk about sort of the differences between the two solutions. And I suppose we can start with the first one, which is complexity, on the right hand side there. So complexity, when I look at it and when I talk to customers, is when you look at VMware and you look at Citrix, there's lots of different things to manage and maintain and operate, and it just becomes a bit of a mess and very complex to keep the lights on from a management perspective. But John, what sort of barriers are you seeing for organization adopting AWS Workspaces in comparative to things like VMware Horizon and Citrix?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that I think I came over to AWS after 17 years at Citrix was, I saw that this was the direction that the market was going in, and I think that certainly to get things going in AWS is so much quicker and so much easier than at Citrix. I think there was, one of the challenges we always faced there was the kind of skills available to actually, get some of these implementations up and running. So that continues, I think, to be a barrier for Citrix. So in some organizations, they've invested heavily in Citrix skills and paid the sort of cost of bringing Citrix people in, and they're in an okay place when it comes to getting Citrix up and running. But I would say for people arriving at these kinds of solutions for the first time, or also looking to hold on to those kind of staff. I mean, you've got it as a later on in terms of skill retention. It can be a real challenge, and because you're so reliant on these people to kind of keep core systems up and running. So yeah, I think the whole managed sort of offering that AWS has, and the speed to which we can get that going really is where people are at today.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that beautifully leads into my next question that I'm probably going to ask you is ultimately sort of the skill retention and the skills required to manage and maintain workspaces. I know from a Camwood perspective, we cross-train all our engineering staff to be able to support multiple solutions in an environment like AWS. Whereas if you compare that to something where Citrix and VMware are implemented, you need dedicated staffing for and skill sets for, and it can be really difficult to maintain and retain sort of the staffing qualities to it. But again, John, so from an organizational perspective, is it quite straightforward, and is it sort of something typical that you see whenever you speak to customers around cross-training employees to support workspaces as well as other AWS infrastructure specifics as well? So can they look after and support multiple different environments within AWS cloud, I suppose?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think people who have some familiarity with the broader sort of AWS cloud offerings come into this with a bit of an advantage. But even if that's not the case, I think it's pretty straightforward. And actually, we offer free training. So we have a couple of training courses that people can do. So there's a kind of primer course that you can go on to get the sort of fundamentals, and then a bit more of a deep dive. And that's available for free for anybody to kind of take. So pretty straightforward to pick up those skills with a bit of investment of time. And then I would say, Dan, it's people like Camwood and your good selves that really help that kind of land on the ground with your experience and, transferring the knowledge of, I don't know, specific applications into the environment, those kinds of things. I mean, what are you seeing from your side?
Yeah, it's very similar to what I mentioned about what the Camwood engineering staff do. So it really is a case of being able to interoperate and sort of change how engineering teams are working. And I think that's more relevant than ever, certainly when we talk about sort of DevOps teams, being able to support operations and development activities as we go through it. So the traditional days of just clicking buttons, etc., are sort of very slowly going away, but they are going away. So being able to change the mindset of how people are adopting and sort of picking up technology is certainly changing as we go through.
Yeah, definitely.
And sort of the final one, and it's probably one of the more relevant ones for me, more than ever, is the accessibility for smaller organizations. So traditionally speaking, when you look at Citrix and VMware, from that point of view, the ability to pick up the technology and start running with it, as John identified, is traditionally quite difficult and very expensive as well. And getting an SME or a smaller, even SMB as well, being able to invest that kind of expenditure and then bring on a partner to look after it and implement it, very, very costly. John, from an organizational perspective, when we're talking about SMB and SME, what's your sort of split in terms of how many SME organizations are adopting workspaces and how many big enterprises are picking up as well?
I mean, we've seen the biggest kind of growth in the SME space, and it does make sense for all the reasons you've said. So the sort of upfront investments on hardware that's needed and skills that are needed in Citrix is quite high. So people in SME type organizations are looking around for something that's quicker, simpler, and perhaps more intuitive when it comes to deployment. And that's why they're landing at solutions like the ones that AWS offer. So it's a large part of our business. Over 80%. If we look at the numbers of organizational entities that we have, over 80% of the numbers of business that we have are in the SME space. Yeah, so we've got some very big deployments as well. And they're disproportionate in terms of the sort of number of seats that they have each. But I think it's 82% have 20 seats or less kind of deployed. So that gives you a sense of how SMEs are kind of regarding this.
It's really significant in terms of a numbers perspective. So yeah, definitely. I mean that reflects kind of what we're seeing as well. A lot of our customers are looking at this as a quick way to get moving, and then they just expand within the environment as a whole, and then they start adopting additional AWS technology services. But at the same time, we still have GCP and Microsoft Azure customers using workspaces because it's a very easy solution, and the ability to connect in all these different type of public cloud providers now is it just makes sense from that point of view.
Absolutely. Yeah, we don't live in a sort of isolated bubble. So I think interconnection is really an important part of, what we do through our APIs and so forth. So I think it's a key part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not the way that Apple approached their devices from that point of view. So it's not closed circuit.
Definitely not.
Excellent. So I'm going to hand over to John. John's much more interesting than I am, and he's going to be talking about some interesting case studies.
Well, I'm not sure about that, Dan. I can't promise that at all. But yes, thank you for that, Dan. So yes, just to go back. So perhaps a bit deeper introduction to who I am. So as I mentioned, 17 years at Citrix, and I've kind of run a bunch of different teams over there, starting from the early 2000s and going through to my sort of final role there when I was running a sort of key accounts team, covering some of the largest customers that Citrix has across EMEA. And last year made the decision to move over to AWS, and a few reasons for that, and some of them I've covered already, in the sense that the general sense on the market is that people are moving much more to a kind of cloud delivery model. While Citrix has Citrix Cloud, it's kind of a sort of hybrid model that they have, still requires some on-premise skills, and actually doesn't have many of the advantages that AWS has around sort of true pay-as-you-go type model. So that was kind of behind the move. So now I'm in AWS, and I run, as I say, the team that it's called the Productivity Applications team, and it includes the sort of Workspaces and AppStream offering. And so many of our sort of specialists in this area kind of report into me. So if you could move on a slide. Thanks. So wanted to cover off a couple of examples for you today on customers that are actually working with AWS and using it to kind of solve business problems. And the first one we've got here is Acuity Knowledge Partners. So if you're not familiar with the name, they're an organization that works heavily in the financial services sector, delivering sort of data solutions to large banks and financial institutions. They have a global sort of presence, so operating in many sort of regions around the world. And they came to us. We were working already with them sort of pre-COVID, but as Dan was alluding to in his presentations, I think COVID, our largest ever global remote working experiment, forced them to kind of really accelerate their plans. So interesting to see that they went from relatively small numbers of workspaces up to 1,800 employees out of their 3,000 sort of working on AWS Workspaces during the pandemic period. And a really nice comment there from David Fellows, you see, just about how important this was for them in terms of business continuity and keeping the lights on. But not only that, I think they had some quite surprising additional benefits from this. So they measured productivity. I think this was a big concern for many organizations is when they moved to this remote working pattern, is like what impact it's going to have on productivity. And one of the things that they saw was actually a 30% increase in productivity. And a lot of it is to do with, I think, as was mentioned, of things around sort of commute time, and unexpected things as well. Though, like we saw, where people might take a day off if they were feeling unwell. When you're working from home and you can sit in your pajamas with your lemsip there, then maybe you will do a little bit of work. So I think they saw those kinds of unexpected benefits. The other thing is to say that the employees that were actually accessing this were kind of geographically dispersed. So they had people in the UK, in India, and in Singapore, kind of using these systems successfully. And of course, they're a highly regulated industry as well. So this kind of ticked all the boxes for them. So really nice example of a customer that was very pleased and continues to be pleased with this, even as they move to more of a sort of hybrid work style from pure remote working. So that's the first example. Can you move on the next slide? So by contrast, we thought that we might use ourselves as an example here. So kind of interesting, you've got a 3,000 employee organization, and then Amazon itself. And so this is broader Amazon, not just the AWS bit of Amazon, at 1.3 million employees also using the same solution. And, we have 100,000 or so employees using this service. And of course, we were using this pre-pandemic as well. So, for us, it's often part of our onboarding process. So, as people are kind of arriving at Amazon, kind of day one, this will be the experience they get, kind of logging in from day one using a workspace to access kind of corporate systems. So, very heavy use internally for us. And the interesting thing here on this is, that volume of delivery and business value is supported by 2 people globally. 2 people support that. So, this is where the real benefits of having a managed desktop really start to kind of kick in, when you can see, something as massive as that being kind of run by 2 people. So, I think that's a great example. And of course, more on that if anybody's interested in to learn more about how we do things internally too. So those are my 2 examples.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Some really, really good use cases, and as John mentioned, it's definitely worth reaching out to AWS, or John specifically, to discuss that a little bit further if needed. Sort of the final ones, just before we close out, is really around the implementation and the transition into solutions like AppStream 2.0 and ultimately Workspaces as well, and how straightforward it is really to get moving. And you can either lean on partners like Camwood or go direct to AWS to get a bit of a steer in terms of how to get moving. But to talk you through sort of the high-level steps and the different levels that you can get involved in, ultimately, from a straightforward perspective, it is very, very easy to start consuming either type of solution. So if we talk about AppStream 2.0 first, it's a case of initially sort of, if you haven't got an AWS subscription already, that's something you'll need to go ahead and do. So if you're joining into it for the first time and you're starting small, you can sign up with a credit card, etc., or leverage the free credits associated to an AWS account that gets newly signed up. But the first thing you do is ultimately select the application that you want to move into AppStream 2.0 and start delivering remotely to your end users. And it's a case of grabbing the application source media, and installing that within an AWS AppStream desktop, and you install it in any way that you would install in all applications. So grab the source media, double click it, install, next, finish. And then from there, it's then a case of connecting up any infrastructure into your existing on-premises environment, or maybe you're starting fresh and vanilla and you want to keep it isolated, that's absolutely fine. So making use of your existing Active Directory, maybe you want to leverage the AWS Directory Services, which is very, very similar to AD, but it's segregated and isolated away. If you want to connect up different application infrastructure and VPN technology, etc., it's absolutely fine. You can take it as detailed and as deep as you want, or if you want to start doing a pilot on the infrastructure and the solution as a whole, very easy, quick to get moving. And then from there, it's just a case of creating users, creating additional application and sort of AppStream pools if you need to, and then distributing it out to end users. So there's very easy and straightforward communication out to end users of send out an email, click on this link, and then off you go and log in with the relevant credentials. And then from there, moving into a BAU perspective, it's about managing the security policies, managing the applications, updating the applications on a regular basis, and to ensure that you're not distributing vulnerable applications out to your end users, and then just rolling into your normal BAU activities as well and adopting more of the platform. And then from a workspace perspective, it is fairly similar. It follows the same sort of logic, but you go around it slightly different. So workspaces, assuming you've got an existing subscription, or maybe you need to provision a new one, you'll just need to register with a WorkSpaces service itself, as well as the identity and networking configuration required for it. Because remember, this is a desktop, so it's going to need authentication, it's going to need networking, etc., to get that moving. But it is all fairly straightforward if you wanted to pick it up and run with it on a pilot perspective. Then you move into a phase of choosing the relevant size and bundle associated to your workspace. So maybe you want to use Windows 10 or Linux. Maybe you want a subset of applications installed on all your workspaces from an imaging perspective. So things like Office, Adobe Reader, Google Chrome, things like that, to be automatically bundled in. And then if you've got specific applications as well you want to wrap into it as well, you can install those, ensure they get delivered out as well, built into your golden images. And then from there, sort of really, it's about centrally managing everything, distributing out workspaces to all your end users, provisioning the workspaces for all the relevant users, and then just moving into that seamless BAU model that we talked about for AppStream 2.0. So making sure the security's there, making sure you've got the operating system update policies there, making sure you've got the application update policies in there as well. And that really just sort of tie it up together. We're not hiding anything in terms of there's so much more under the hood that you need to do. These 4 steps for AppStream and Workspace, they're very, very easy and very quick to pick up and start moving with. I think we did a pilot with a customer a few months ago, and it was a case of, here's our AWS subscription, can you get us moving? And we were moving within 3 or 4 hours. They had a Workspace, they had an AppStream 2.0 solution in place, and they started delivering it out to pilot users by the end of the day. So being able to move, configure, and deploy within a 24-hour window is absolutely fantastic, and that's why AWS has done really, really well in this particular space. So finally, just before we sort of wrap up and say thank you for everyone, we've had a few questions drop in and hit the Q&A panel. So what I will do is, John, I'm probably going to pick on you again because, like I said, I think people are more interested to talk to you than they are to me. I've got a few questions here, if that's all right, John, if I can start firing them in your direction.
Sure, yeah, fire away.
Excellent. So the first question is, how is it best for organizations new to AWS end user computing to get started? Now, I think I know I talked about the sort of the transition, but maybe the engagement model that they might be talking about.
Yeah, I mean, could be. So I guess the first thing is maybe take the training. It's free, so have a look at that and dig in a little bit on some of the details that you've kind of talked about there. So that would be the first thing, perhaps. There's a free kind of version of the product that you can have a look at to trial as well. So download and have a go with that. So I suggest those 2 things, and probably come and talk to people like yourself, Dan, would be my other suggestion as well, and perhaps utilize some of the experiences you have where you've talked about specific deployments of particular types of applications as well that may have some subtlety or nuance to them. I mean, that would be kind of my suggestion. I don't know, Dan, what's been your sort of experience of this?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So Camwood as an organization perspective and heritage, and John, this is where you know us from, is ultimately with the application space. So it's the infrastructure side of things is nice and easy, quick to get moving. It's the applications that concern customers. So it's really a case of just understanding what applications need to be moved across into something like Workspaces or AppStream 2.0, and how potentially we, Camwood as an organization can help organizations through that process. So Camwood, from a solution stack perspective, we've done hundreds, if not thousands, of VDI deployments from a traditional on-prem Citrix, VMware, RDS, AVD, those sorts of things, to all the way up to more modern technologies like Microsoft Azure, GCP, and AWS as well. So for us, the infrastructure is nice and easy. It's the apps where it gets really, really confusing and complex. So it's really a case of come and talk to us, come and talk to John and the AWS team, and let us know what your challenges are, and ultimately how we can help organizations and sort of you guys to move forwards on a solution like this.
Definitely.
Excellent. Next one's a bit of a contentious one, and I knew we wouldn't get away without talking about the pandemic in sort of serious length. So how applicable are cloud PCs? I think we're referring to Workspaces in this particular instance. Now the pandemic restrictions are reducing. I think that's probably fair to say. If we've got any non-UK attendees this morning, the UK restrictions have been completely removed. So from a UK perspective, we're free to move around and go into the office, etc. But I suppose, John, from an applicable perspective, and I think it's more really about hybrid working and how it's here to stay. Do you think Workspaces and AppStream 2.0 are more relevant than ever, even though the pandemic restrictions are gone?
Well, I think the genie's out of the bottle really now, isn't it? So if you were in an organization that was 5 days a week in the office before, and your job at all allows for you to do anything from home, I think, or remotely, let's say not even from home, I think you're not going to be probably abandoning that anytime soon. And the message on hybrid working, I think, is where things are at. So I think it's just the degree in getting that balance right. I know a lot of organizations are kicking that around. So, what's the right amount of time in the office? Do I leave it to my employees to kind of make that call for themselves, or do I start mandating it? In which case, do I end up with an office that's empty on Mondays and Fridays, and then sort of packed to the rafters on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, and have all of that sort of stuff. So I think it's going to be an interesting time as you say, as the restrictions evolve. But I think for me, the underlying technology and the relevance of kind of cloud PCs and workspaces and so forth is that I think once you're on this kind of system, it really doesn't matter where you work. So even if you're going into the office, are you really going to do a different set of things as a user compared to where you were at home? And the ideal scenario is that, you just do the same stuff. Whatever it is that you log into, however you get into that, is the same whether you're at home, in the office, working in a sort of remote setting. We're also hearing about a lot of these kind of co-working locations. So whereas people may have kind of traveled into city centres pre-COVID, and working from home isn't 100% ideal for them either. Having a more local location might be a sort of nice alternative that kind of brings maybe the best of both worlds. So you kind of leave home, get away from the home environment for a bit, and maybe work with colleagues, but don't have the kind of the commute or whatever into a city centre. So I think all of these things mean it's an experimental time, but the technology underneath it all remains consistent, remains highly relevant, and supports all of those options.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we talked about it a little bit earlier around the end user experience and the consistency, regardless of if you're at home, you're in a coffee shop, you're in a conference room, you're in the office. The end user gets the same experience regardless of sort of location associated to that, and that's something that Workspaces can deliver across the board.
Definitely.
I know we're running out of time, but I'm going to squeeze one more question out. And John, this is going to be another very contentious one. And I do apologise for asking this question, but I'm always interested in these kind of things. How do solutions like AWS Workspaces, AppStream compare to, I think it's quite relevant, things like Citrix Cloud, Azure, VMware Horizon? Have you got an opinion? I know you'll probably have to take your AWS hat off for a second, but someone that was heavily involved in Citrix, I think it'd be good to get sort of your opinion on how things are evolving and I'm not saying one's better than the other, but it's interesting to see someone in your position what the kind of differences are.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting market, isn't it? And customers do have choice here, which I think is good, always good from a customer perspective as well. So, if I think about Citrix and VMware, that have come from the kind of on-premise data center world. I think there's still a place for that, and if you're, I don't know, a large investment bank with a big IT team that wants to do a lot of custom development and things like that, then I think there's going to be a place for the likes of Citrix and VMware to kind of deal with that highly tailored environment. So certainly something there. And I think maybe the Azure virtual desktop has a place kind of in the middle somewhere as well, because that's going to need some management. Even if it's cloud, it's going to need some management. But if you want something that's going to spin up quickly, is a managed service, is going to get you kind of up and running in a simple way, then I think that's where AWS plays well. So for me, there are definitely kind of niches and market focuses for each of these technology sets. And I guess as our customers, you want to kind of work out where you are in that sort of spectrum, and maybe you have some choice on vendors that you speak to.
Yeah, I think the most important thing, especially when we're talking about public cloud, is competition, because ultimately each vendor is driving each other forwards, and solution stacks only get better from that point of view. And I think the use cases you pulled out there in terms of the sort of the banking sector, etc., there will always be a place for those type of solutions like Citrix in there. But I think as people are starting to evolve and organizations are starting to evolve, employees want more. In terms of being able to deliver more, they want to be more productive. They want access to the latest and greatest. I think that's more relevant than ever, in my opinion.
Yeah, and one other sort of contrast for me joining AWS is just the pace of innovation here. So AWS does a sort of 3-month induction when you first start. So you're not kind of allowed to go and do anything other than these induction program for the first 3 months. But during that time, there was, I think, 7 new releases around our EUC portfolio in the 3 months that I first joined. And I was kind of thinking back to my Citrix days, it's like 7 new features. So how long would that have taken Citrix to do? And I can tell you it would be a lot longer than 3 months. Yeah. So innovation is the other thing here, and that's constant. And that's a sort of a broader AWS kind of tenet, really, that we are looking to constantly innovate, and the evidence is there on the ground of the way we're constantly driving the portfolio forward.
No, I completely agree. Public cloud providers are ultimately changing how the technology sector is working, and it's quite interesting to see 3 months that are only releases. Very busy time for you. So it must have been a bit of a culture shock, I suppose.
Absolutely. Yeah, really was. So and interesting as to how that sort of manifests itself for people on the call that take other services from AWS. I'm sure they see that across the piece.
Excellent. I think we're bang out of time now. So I just want to extend sort of big thank you for John for joining us today, and a big thank you to everyone else for attending the webinar. Hopefully that was really helpful. My details are on the screen, but feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to reach out to John if you've got any specific questions or if you want to learn more about technology. But again, John, thank you so much for making the time today.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks everyone for joining.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. And like I said, feel free to reach out if you have any questions.